What is really, really interesting about Peter is he is an ecologist and an advisor to governments and all sorts of other agencies. And he's also a bit of a shaman. And I think that's what much of what happens in the symposium is all about, that marriage of the two different realms, if you like, the very practical and the very spiritual. Now, Peter first came here a couple of years ago to talk to us about climate change and caused quite an interesting reaction with his analysis of the situation. And it was very much enjoyed and appreciated. So Peter's going to talk more on that, I think. And so please welcome Peter Taylor.
Thank you. This is the view that way, out towards the sea and the Somerset Levels. At least it looks rather like the Somerset Levels. And if you can see on the sand spit there's a nuclear reactor, and there is some power lines and a small town, could be Bridgewater, a small seaside town, and lots of empty space. Not much food production going on, and all of the energy production is coming from that little box. And this is all about to change. And normally I do a presentation on, that's actually a computer model. It's a virtual reality construction of a sort of generic landscape. And it was commissioned by the government. When it was said that I advise governments, I used to. They're not really listening to me at the moment. But they used to listen. And one of the things that I was doing in this project was to look at how we integrate all the renewable energy technology into not only the landscape, but communities. And how do we safeguard biodiversity? And how do we safeguard the recreation of our spirit, which we use the countryside and the seaside and the mountains. We use it for that. And I care about those things, particularly biodiversity. I just spent 10 years working on biodiversity and ecological networks, having spent the previous 20 years trying to stop very nasty things happening, mostly the dumping of toxic waste. And that's when I went all the way up to within the interstices of the EU, the European Commission, the UN. I was Greenpeace's chief legal advocate at the UN for about 10 years. So I have a scientific training, and I also taught myself some law. And I had a little institute in Oxford that backed me up in all of that. So after all of that negative work, I wanted to do something positive. I wanted to look at how we were going to integrate the future that had been put to us by friends of mine who, having gone on from the toxic waste issues, had gone on to the climate convention. So my friends actually wrote the legal framework for the Kyoto Protocol, the climate convention, and everything that is actually pushing policy, which I'm sure you all know about. Let me just go back. So this is what we are expecting. I say we. Collectively, as a civilization, the message has been put out that sea level is rising, the global temperature is rising, things are accelerating. The Arctic is melting down. If the ice caps accelerate, which it looks like they will, we're going to be inundated. Now, it might take a while before we are inundated. This is like 2050. But if you're living in Bangladesh or the South Pacific or whatever, then you are immediately threatened by sea level rise and tornadoes and extra storms coming in, and you know the story. So, again, in our lovely computer model, we can flood it. We can look at rising sea levels, and we could look at the answers. And there are huge teams worldwide working on this because we know that the oil will run out, and also that we can't actually use the oil or the coal Because if we do that, we'll pump more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the globe will accelerate in its warmth. And so we have to wean ourselves off fossil fuels, and we have to find the energy from renewable sources. So that landscape becomes transformed. We build a barrage across the estuaries. This is a small estuary. We can get a certain amount of tidal power. We can put turbines. We can replace the aging nuclear reactors. We've got one out here that would normally be out of commission within 5 years. I spent my whole life trying to get that so that we didn't have nuclear reactors, because I know what happens to the waste. So the idea is you put a new core in the reactor, and you also have to have the turbines, and you have to have the tidal barrages, and the biofuels, and so forth. So we were modeling the choices. How much leeway do we have in the system? Could we do without nuclear power, for example? Could we get everything from renewable sources? So we're looking at a transformation of a landscape. Concrete, steel. It becomes an electro-technical landscape. Biofuels and wind farms, they are being planned right now. In fact, you can't avoid it because this government signed up to an EU directive. The biofuels and the turbines, we're going to have thousands of new turbines. And there are plans now across the Mendips. We already have one on the Mendips, which was erected against the wishes of the local people. So local democracy is being eroded. This was a central government decision. No, we know it's an area of natural beauty. You have to make this sacrifice. And that's only the beginning. The whole of Scotland, all throughout Wales, turbines, barrages across the Severn, more nuclear. And the biofuels, there's no way, there's not enough biofuels in Britain. Even if you were to convert all of our landscape to biofuels, there wouldn't be enough to meet the EU directive. So already now big multinational corporations are going out there to find the biofuels to fuel our needs. Not even our future needs, but by 2010, we have to have 5% in the petrol pumps. We produce 1 million tons of wheat a year, surplus to our requirements. One plant being built on the Humberside, costing £200 million, will now take 1 million tons of wheat per annum to turn it into ethanol for our petrol tanks. And we need 10 of those. Well, that's our wheat surplus is already gone. So now the Tana River Wilderness in Kenya has just been signed over by the Kenyan government. Biofuels, bioethanol. The wilderness is going to be trashed. There are lions, giraffes. It's one of the most amazing places. It's going. The Amazon, Borneo, palm oil, soya oil, biodiesels. Companies are even buying up rice husks to burn in our coal-fired power stations because they have to burn 10% biomass along with the coal. So these big companies with our money, and we're very rich, they are going out now throughout the world buying up the renewable energy resources of other countries. So we were concerned, I keep doing that. We were concerned to look at a possible alternative future. And I spent 3 years looking at this, and these computer programs were designed by a resident genius within the Glastonbury bubble, Richard Fraser, and I worked with him. He did all the graphics. I just told him, how it ought to look. We were actually trying to persuade government that you could actually create wildernesses. You take away the nuclear station, you allow that whole area to re-wild. And if you then live a different kind of lifestyle within your town, you can expand the town, make it solar, certain amount of biofuels, horticulture, more of a vegetarian lifestyle. You could do without the nuclear, and out at sea you can't see them so well. There are all the turbines you could hope for, but they're not in view and they don't damage your recreational resources. And we were doing this for the western landscape as well. Here's what's actually happening. Commercial forestry and forest residue power stations. As soon as you do that, you tie yourself in for the whole of the future into commercial forestry and using the waste or the residue. Turbines, biggest you can find on the hilltops because that's the most economic. Wood chip power stations, well, we don't have enough wood chip, so it will come in. It will come in from all the forests that are willing to be sold, Latvia, Borneo, wherever. New roads, the whole deal. A high-tech, renewable energy future. And again, we were trying to persuade government there's another way forward. And if you downscale, maximum solar, small-scale, short rotation coppices which are tracted in, instead of having a big station, 50 megawatts, you have 1 megawatt, enough for a small town, and then the farmers grow your wood chip. But I have to tell you that none of that integrated way forward is going to happen. It's a dictate of economics. It just is not happening. The whole direction is going the other way. And I can give you chapter and verse of all of that. It's politics. I've written a book about it, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But last night, I had a download. So I promised Spirit, being as how my cover is blown, and I know you've been told that I do shamanic stuff. And Spirit said, no, look, you're among friends. See, normally I'm within the bubble, and that is where I go. I go out of the Glastonbury bubble, and I talk to the scientific world. And so I talk their language, and I stay within their paradigm. And if I mention shamanic stuff, or astrology, or crop circles, they would walk out. They would walk out. Now, that's the world that's making all the decisions for us. And I have to disguise myself. So, basically, to say you don't have to do that. You can really talk from the heart and tell it how it is, and tell them who you are. So I thought, you mean the whole story? Yeah. So don't worry, I'm not going to tell you that I'm a lizard or a walk-in or the Son of God, But I do have some history, and I've only really understood it fully. And this happened yesterday when I was doing my book signing, and a friend came in. Now, she's a doctoral level sociologist, and so we have this kind of academic thing. But she's also got long grey dreads, and she lives in the woods and has done for 10 years. And she looks after the shrines to Bridget and the goddess, and she does fire. And she also works with me shamanically. I have a kind of very male tradition, so I like to work with the feminine as best I can. And so we've worked together for a couple of years. And she said to me, they're going to put a barrage across the Severn, aren't they? And I said, oh yeah, that's really central to the government's plans, 7 gigawatts, they're never going to not do that. Concrete, steel, motor, the whole deal. And she just said, but it's the goddess, the Severn, And I just thought, yeah, but I can't say that. And I suddenly realized the depth of the disjunction. And this bubble that we live in, that you can do this meditation that you did before lunch. I'm very glad I caught that. Behind us, in the other direction, there's the Tor. There's a labyrinth in the land that's been here for thousands of years. There's the Eggstone. There's the Abbey. In the Abbey, there's a grave to the mythic Arthur, the sacred king, the last great myth of our time. And there's a stone, Jesus Maria, which shows that magically the Celtic Christian religion here was still holding the Magdalene and the goddess against all the forces that were at work. This is a mythic landscape. It's very deep. And I wouldn't have been able to appreciate it. I moved here 10 years ago. The previous 10 years, I lived in the forest, and I was under shamanic instruction. And that shamanic instruction began with a Himalayan master, yogic fundamentally, then Native American, and then neo-Druids, and you've had one, Philip Carr-Gomm here. I didn't catch his talk. But I worked with Obod. I worked with people who were awakening to what they'd lost and then trying to find it again. And so the Celtic druids, the neo-Celtic druids, my best friend and teacher was at Cambridge doing maths, and he's sacred geometry and astronomy, and he builds stone circles. And so I started to get a deeper connection to this land, to the shamanism of this place and Glastonbury. And so now I'm connected. If you go to some of the festivals, then the people on the gate, the security, the accountants, the people doing the tickets, the people looking after the fire, some of the musicians, some of the people backstage that are putting this new wave of music, yes, but also consciousness, the teepee village, the Buddha field, all of this, reaching out to the young people. They've gone through my little trainings with the ghost dance, with shamanic dance. We have a tribal society in this town. You don't see it very clearly because the town is pretty much held by a straight world, and it would fall apart without that, without the doctors and the nurses, the teachers, the police, the fire people, very straight. But the tribal society can also exist here. Sometimes they run the cafes, the crystal shops, and all of that. And most of them actually are quite earthy, and they're jobbing builders and carpenters and so forth. But they are the ones who come together, and they dance, and they put the prayers out to Great Spirit. But that's in the bubble. We live in a mythic landscape. So there's another dimension to existence, and you understand these dimensions. If I talk about other dimensions in this world, then, like I say, there's an immediate blank, there's an immediate cutoff. So that's what I really want to deal with today. What is this cutoff? How did it happen? And the people who are disconnected, they are making the decisions. They are the ones who are creating this future, this electro-technical landscape. And it goes beyond our shores. We're not as bad as some other countries right now in this renewable energy push. And there are reasons for that, which I'll go into in more depth. But other countries know, as indeed our scientists know but won't tell you, and that is that over the next 10 or 20 years, the globe is going to cool. And more than that, it could get very cold indeed in the northern hemisphere. Now, as the further east you go, talk to Russian scientists, talk to Chinese scientists, they know this. The Chinese government, the Russian government, the Japanese government, the Korean government, they're buying land. They're buying cropland. Recently, if you add up the purchases, 30 million hectares. That's about 7 times the crop area of Britain has been bought by large companies and sovereign funds. The Chinese bought 1.5 million acres of Madagascar to grow food and fuel crops. They know the cold is coming, and they know they haven't got enough food. They know that there's a world market, that legally you can buy land and you can export food. Now, you can't buy land in Paraguay, Cambodia, Laos, Congo. Chinese bought 1 million acres of the Congo forest. You can't buy that land without getting rid of the people. And in the forest, they're largely indigenous. In the savannas and the other areas, they're peasants. Get them off the land into the cities, into the favelas, get them on a slave wage, and then you can grow what you like. That's happening. It's happening right now. We're party to it. Some of the biggest companies in the world living here are doing it. The people who build the windmills, they also build the nuclear reactors, AMEC, Siemens. So the renewable energy push has a vast business empire behind it. And it's going to be financed by your taxes. You're going to start paying carbon taxes. There will be carbon banks, carbon currency, a global carbon currency. In December, that will be decided. You have no chance of altering that decision because every government has signed up for it. That will unleash vast billions of carbon trading and push more and more people off the land, create the biofuels and so on. This is happening. This is the future. And There's a whole science of it. And what I want to do is very quickly move through that science, because there's deeper questions here. What I want to move through the science. I'm going to do it quickly. There is a book which you can buy, which has it all, and it's 4 years' work. And so I don't want to spend time repeating something that, if you're really interested in the science, you can read. But I want to move through the science sufficiently so that you get a sense. I hope you can get a sense of where I'm coming from. When I say I'm an old shaman, I only just realized that I had it right at the very beginning when I was a teenager. Where is it? Where's the spirit? And I didn't have any education. My mother and father were very, very humble origins. He was a bus driver and she was a nurse. But he was also an old warrior, during the war and that whole thing. And he joined the forces and we moved around a lot. So I had no spiritual guidance. I had no academic guidance. I wasn't pushed. I went to university. I went to the best university because I wanted to understand the human condition. It was a mystery. I couldn't find any answers there at all. So I left. And I went walkabout. And I ended up in a small area of Germany, not dissimilar to that landscape you saw at the beginning. And I made friends, and I started working with young people and introducing them to nature. And then one year, this all changed. This huge conglomerate nuclear processing plant was planned. And they came into town, small village, described what they were going to do. And I thought, these guys are lying through their teeth. I know something. I'm an ecologist by training. And so I was alerted and I made friends within the kind of German underground, and we fought 10 years against that plant, and we won. And we stopped Sweden doing it as well. And we started to shut things down, the fast breeder program, dumping of nuclear waste in the ocean. But actually there's a little interval that I'd kind of forgotten, and that is that before I got into the battle, I came back to Oxford University and I thought, I've got to understand what it is we're up against. So I enrolled at the Institute of Social Anthropology, and I trained as an anthropologist to do with language and symbol and consciousness. And when I was a biologist, a little bit of time I spent leading an expedition of biologists into the African jungle. And that came through last night, and I remembered it. I thought, what are you telling me? And we're telling you that when you were in that jungle with 6 biologists and teams of trackers, skinners, porters, guides, we were in dangerous territory. There were animals in there that could have you for lunch, if they chose. And all kinds of dangerous animals that if you, were a little bit careless, they could give you a hard time. But actually, we were completely safe. The most dangerous thing in that jungle was the human beings. And in particular, one of the trackers who wasn't doing his job properly, and the other trackers wanted to get rid of him, but he was a magician, and they were scared of him. So I had to trick him, get him off the camp, and fire him. And in the aftermath of that, I learned a lot about magic and his powers and hurting people, mostly people who helped me. And so when I came back and enrolled at the Institute, I wanted to understand causation and the magical world. And I had very little schooling, except a little bit of yoga. But during that training, I said to my supervisors, and I was enrolled for a PhD and an academic career in the university, I want to turn the tables. You all go out as anthropologists looking at these simple, primitive peoples and making all kinds of patterns and theories about who they are and how they work. I've actually been out there, and it's not all mumbo jumbo, they really have a way into other dimensions. And what are you doing? Why are you going out studying them? I mean, look at the way science runs this culture. There's a tribe here. There's a tribe of scientists. They have rituals. I want to study scientists as an anthropologist would. I was in the wrong university. If I'd been in another university, they did have sociology of science, Hey, scientists, what are you doing? What's informing your perceptions? How do you make your hypotheses? Is there a bit of gender bias going on here? Are you influenced by the social and political environment? Who pays the tune? Where has science allied? Did you ally with the people? or did you ally with the merchants and the military? When you work in the medical issue, are you working for preventative medicine, or are you working to sell drugs to manage the diseases? So there were lots of questions, and like I said, I was in the wrong place. And I said, okay, well, I'm leaving then. I'll found my own institute, thank you very much. And I did. And I ran it for 12 years, and I brought together planners, engineers, scientists, committed people, and we decided to fight the machine within their terms. So I had to go undercover. I had to disguise myself initially as a sociologist, and then even that, I would present the data and say, we can't work with this. So we went into the engineering, we went into uncovering the corruption, the corrupt models, the models that said you could get away with dumping nuclear waste in the ocean, it won't come back. The ocean is self-cleansing. The waste adheres to little particles and goes down into the mud and you never see it again. So my job was to go find the models, go find the data, the oceanography, and say, hey, no, it comes back. And we took that all the way up to the UN and we won because we were really good scientists. And my friend in that battle went on to the climate convention, and he's endorsed my book. And he said, I'm a believer in global warming, I've believed it all my life, but Peter's questions have got to be answered. And those are the questions that I'm going to put to you. But again, I'm still in that. Let's play them at their own game. Let's fight them at their own game. Let's try to change them. And from the shamanic side, what I'm being told is there's no more time. The whole thing is changing very quickly now. And this is something you know about. There's a shift happening. So what I realized about that story is that I was always this kind of shamanic incarnation from wherever. And that my journey through all that battle, I have been to the top of Canary Wharf. I've been amongst those chief executives. I've sat down with ministers, scientists in the EU, in the UN, and I suddenly realized, what was I doing? I was gathering knowledge. Who are they? How do they think? And that's a shamanic technique. It's in the medicine cards, it's ferret energy. And it's the energy where you disguise yourself, you go into the enemy camp, you find out what their plans are, and then you come back to the tribe. So this is my tribe, and I've been out there, and I've sussed a fair amount. And what hit me last night was when Spirit said, no, you can talk about dimensions here. In the world of science, there is only really the physical dimension. They tell you that that's what they believe. Many of you have experienced knowledge of another dimension, another dimensional reality. And it happened to me here in the middle of a dance that we were doing. We were working with a rose quartz crystal skull. And I had it all choreographed. Fantastic musicians, big rave. You bring the rave down, you bring out the skull. And I said, ooh, what's happening? And this is time for prayers. No, you don't call it a prayer. But what Solara said about gratitude, this is a time for gratitude. You've all had a good time. Let's take the energy up now into a sound. And it's a prayer. The skull goes up, and that prayer goes back to, for us, it's the great mystery. And in that space, I saw something. And I almost couldn't, I was supposed to be dancing. And how do I dance? Because my body wasn't there anymore. And I just had to trust. But what I saw was a crack in reality. And in that crack, there was another dimension. And it was crystal, and it was airy, and it was liquid. You couldn't put words to it. But what hit me was the frequency and the vibration which came straight into my heart. I thought, wow, this is love. This is what they talk about. This is the other dimension that interpenetrates this one, and it is just pure love, and it's the vibration of this quartz crystal. So I thought, wow, that means that the love that we have inside of us is throughout the galaxy. It's a part of nature. It's a natural force. Science hasn't got a clue that this is This is the power. This is what it is. And we resonate with it in our hearts. This is amazing, right? So I thought, wow, that's amazing. Anyway, last night, reviewing my journey into the empire, up to the top of those buildings, talking to the scientists, the engineers, the Al Gores of this world, the carbon traders, the banks, the military, the merchants, the electrotechnical future. There's no love there. They don't operate like that. They even have an ethical banking, which is a small percentage, It's like banking with love. The rest of it is not ethical. There's no love there. There's no democracy either. It's on a military model. It's a command structure all the way up to the top guy. This is the empire. This is another empire. And how come we've built a huge empire without love? And it's like, when I get back here to my tribe, and I mean, it's pretty dysfunctional, I tell you. I'm not going to, build it up to be what it isn't. And we just struggle through to maintain a foothold in daily existence, holding true to our spirit. But we're tribal. It's a tribal consciousness. Love rules. We can't be part of the empire. We can't support it. So I thought, okay, that is the context. Now I want to tell you what the empire is planning. Okay, first of all, you are told it's a greenhouse effect. And carbon dioxide, you are the guilty ones. It's your emissions that are changing the climate. So you are guilty, and also it's very scary. It's a scary climate story. So be afraid. Be afraid of the weather, be afraid of the climate. And this is global warming. The last 150 years is very real. I'm not denying that. The planet has got warmer. This is the global average temperature. I put 3 sort of turquoisey arrows. Please note them. They're about 60 or 70 years apart. That's what's called a cycle. Now, that is generally ignored by modern climate science. That's the red is the temperature, and you'll see that it goes up over 150 years, along with carbon dioxide. The two are correlated. And because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, it has been assumed by the climate scientists that that's causing it. The correlation is not perfect. What I want to draw your attention to here is, first of all, the peak on the left, which is in 1940. The purple is the global temperature again. Well, actually not global, this is just the North American continent. It's a bit clearer here. And you'll find that just as carbon dioxide really started to take off, the global temperature started to drop. And you have this trough until probably about 1980 globally, and not until about the year 2000 in the United States did the temperature come back up to where it was in 1934. So you have a cycle. And the correlation in the middle of that cycle is not perfect. Now, whole science goes on from that point, building computer models, working with that. But if you go to China, they don't have such a short-term perspective. And there you will find, and they work with proxy data, tree rings, stalagmites. They get their hands dirty. They're not playing with computer models that cost millions and millions of pounds. And there you will see that there is a cycle, and there's a trough about 400 years ago. And that prior to that, temperatures were just as warm as they are now on the planet before we were pumping out carbon dioxide. And there are even longer-term cycles than that. But nobody knows what drives these cycles. So you can't put them into your computer model, so the computer modelers just leave them out. Now, you'll notice that whenever it dips, along with the Chinese characters, there's a translation. And that says famine. Whenever the temperature has dropped in China, there has been famine. And there was widespread famine 400 years ago, as indeed there was in Europe. I'll come back to that. Now, if you take 150 years And that cycle within there, you can see two fluctuations. And you extrapolate from the last bit, you're going to get temperatures going through the roof. If you extrapolate the long-term trend, you get a different arrow. If you do what the Chinese did, and you look for the cycle, you get the arrow, it may go down. And what I will show you is that it is going down. The latest evidence for the last few years points to the fact that the Chinese are right and our computer models are wrong. This is the global temperature as measured by the 4 official temperature data collection sources that feed into the UN. The trend over the last 7 years, in all of those cases, the atmosphere at different levels and the ground, the surface and the oceans, it's cooling. The oceans, the southern oceans, which are more than half the planet in terms of, it's only the ocean that can store the sun's heat. It bounces off the land effectively, goes cold again very quickly. So it's the receiving of the heat by the ocean and the releasing of it which governs our climate. The southern oceans have been cooling. You also notice that actually they were a lot warmer in 1880. Sea level is going to go through the roof, you're told. Well, as the oceans cool, the sea level rise tails off. And so when I visited I had to get this data myself. University of Colorado correlates the data for the UN, and you'll find that sea level rise has started to tail off just as the oceans are cooling. So it's not carbon dioxide that's driving the sea level, it's the expansion, the thermal expansion of the oceans, which has now stopped. And you're told hurricanes, big hurricanes in the last few years. If you measure hurricanes not by their number, but by the amount of energy they contain, called accumulated cyclonic energy, ACE, you'll find, guess what, a cycle. And in the past, just as serious as now, go back to 1850, you can see 2 cycles, North Atlantic cycle, about 60 or 70 years. The reason why it's so much more devastating now is there are many more people living on the coast. Vast billions of investment, highly costly to the insurance companies and so forth. The Arctic is melting down. Yes, it is. 50% of the summer sea ice was lost within 3 years, between 2003 and 2006, 2007. So if you extrapolate that, there will be no ice in the summer in the Arctic by 2015. But extrapolation is not sensible if there's a cycle involved. And if you go back to 1940, you'll find that most of the Arctic temperature stations recorded their highest temperatures then. And in a few places, they've exceeded. But you can see the right-hand diagram, it's still peaking in the Arctic, but once the cycle sets in, it's going to go down and it will refreeze. And that's been going on for a long time. The Arctic ice has been thinning now since 1790, a fairly regular rate. And what was it doing 400 years ago during the really cold time? Well, nobody was measuring it. And you're told, the glaciers are melting down. Yes, they are, and they've been melting down since 1750 at a fairly steady rate. I draw your attention to the last few years, and what you will see are not being told is that some glaciers are already regrowing, as one might expect as the cycles change, especially in New Zealand. So the cause of these cycles, well, as far as science is concerned, it's still a mystery. And because it can't be mathematically determined, I'll tell you why in a minute, they're not put in the models. And there is a correlation to the solar magnetic cycle, but because we don't know the mechanism, again, you can't put the maths in the models, so they leave them out. And so my first question in 2003, having accepted the story, was, has anything else happened other than carbon dioxide? Now, I'm a fairly well-connected scientist, and like I say, some of my friends work within the UN system, and I didn't know the answer to that. Now, it's generally a lot more publicized in the last few years, but yes, something had changed. The sun had changed. And on the right-hand side there, you can see that green line is a proxy for solar activity. The sun was doing something very unusual in the last 150 years. It also has a cycle, and it's done this unusual thing before. And that unusual thing relates to its magnetic fields, which are thought not to have any influence on climate. How can a magnetic field influence climate? Now, that was accepted wisdom in 1990 when Kyoto was thought of, in 95 when it was signed, and in 2001 when the IPCC's third scientific report was made. But Danish scientists had already focused on this active period of the sun, and they were thinking, we're not buying this story. Now, Denmark's a small country. It even has a space center, which is where these guys worked. Just to show you a little bit more about the cycles, they've been going on for some time. That top left-hand graph shows that we've had cycles for 8,000 years. Warm periods, cold periods. How can it be possible that modern science didn't take this into account? That's a very valid question. I won't go into the science, it's to do with isotopes. And what you see there, the green, is the increase in the interplanetary field. This is the magnetic field that surrounds us. Sunspot cycles, since 10,000 BC, there's a way of computing what they were, and you'll see that the sun was incredibly active at the end of the Ice Age on a magnetic level, and that there's been a recent peak around the year 2000. And again, you can see cycles. And actually, these cycles are waves. They're waveforms. And they correspond with what we know about temperatures, when we can use proxies for what the temperature was doing, like stalagmites, like ice cores, and so forth. We find they're directly in line with the sunspot cycles. How come I didn't know this? In the whole of my education to 2003, I didn't know it, and I had to find it out. And then go talking to people and say, well, hang on a minute, why isn't this common knowledge? Just to show you a bit of the beauty and who we are and where we are, the bottom left is the sun, and it has an electromagnetic sheath, and that is filled with a kind of dilute plasma. It's like a giant cell moving through space, and it moves through the galaxy. The bow shock, all of that light, is actually galactic space, which is not empty. And then the sun itself puts out energy on an electromagnetic level and a plasma level, and the Earth has a protective sphere, and as that hits the Earth, you get this incredible effect. You can see it in the aurora borealis. And so we live in an electromagnetic universe. What's this got to do with climate? Well, the last time Europe really froze, this was a 100-year period when the Thames froze every winter. You could go skating on it. There was widespread famine and disease. The electromagnetic field had dropped. There were no sunspots for that period of time, known as the Maunder minimum. We've been recovering from that time since then. And some solar scientists think we're approaching another one. What I want to draw your attention to there is, again, this business of famine, food. So the sun goes through cycles. On the left, that's at its peak during the solar cycle. Of course, you don't see it that way. This is an X-ray photograph. But there's a lot of energy coming out of the sun on an invisible level, not sunlight. And then it goes quiet in the middle of its cycle. Those cycles are 11 years long. And as you can see, they've been building up over 150 years to a peak. They're now starting to fall. Those Danish scientists I told you about, very regular scientists, physicists, they were interested in the mystery of the cycles. Nobody else seemed to have been bothering. And they noticed, they were looking for a mechanism. How could magnetism influence the climate? And earlier I showed you that picture of the greenhouse. Far more important than the gases are the clouds. On a cloudy day, it's cool. Clouds go, woof. Especially the oceans heat up. That's the dynamic of the climate. So they looked at clouds, and guess what they found? the red and the blue, they're tracking the incoming cosmic rays. The cosmic rays are affected by how much the Earth is magnetic. Strong magnetic keeps the rays out, weak magnetic, in come the rays. And what they found is that when the rays were coming in, the clouds increased. Cosmic rays are ionizing and they create little seeds for clouds. Now they tried to publish in the year 2000, 2001. They couldn't. They published a little bit. They couldn't get funding to prove the mechanism. It took 6 years. 2006 they published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, International Peer Review, we've got a mechanism. That was about 6 months before the latest IPCC UN report. Oh, we can't deal with the science. And now they have a 60 million euro program at CERN to look at the mechanisms with the European Space Agency. Did they tell you this? No. Our scientists don't want to know about that because it's too embarrassing, because they've opposed this analysis. And they'll slag it off. So when I came to look at this, I thought, well, satellite data, clouds. What you find, this is a review of the satellite data published in 2005, so you can see it comes rather late to influence the UN. 5% change in cloud over the period of global warming. 5% change in cloud is perfectly enough to generate the heat in the ocean to create the whole of global warming. You don't need carbon dioxide. Actually, it can't be both. They both can't be true stories. This is a true story, so the carbon dioxide models are wrong. And in my book, I go through the physics of that. I'm a physicist. I'm quoting other physicists who say, we can't believe how naive these models are. The mathematics, you can't, Anyway, that's another story. Actually, you can compute the carbon dioxide effect. It's the little red bit. The rest, same energy, that in terms of radiation power or power to heat, is sunlight coming through because the clouds have thinned. That's the last 25, 30 years. More energy coming into the oceans, creating global warming. This is short-wave radiation, visible light, which heats the ocean. The warm bit at the top you swim in, and it's cold underneath. That is where all of the Earth's heat comes from. That's why we don't freeze. And there's more energy coming in there than there is from the carbon dioxide model. And even that little red bit, I think, is overblown by a factor of 3. So that means I can show you, and I demonstrated in the book, please buy it, can explain the whole of global warming. And then the second half of the book is how come science made such an error and what should we really be doing. And it's also endorsed by Professor Jackson Davis, who I didn't know this when I asked him to endorse the book. I said, Jackson, you know me from the old. They don't know me anymore. They forget the 80s and all of that work that I did. So you know me. I'm I've got a brain and I'm a scientist. And you just find something nice to say about me. You don't even have to read the book. And because I know he works in the UN on the global warming issue, And he said, Peter, how can you be right? But he's read the book. And what he says is these questions have got to be answered. And what I didn't know is that when he was on the UN committee, they gave him the job of being the first author, to produce the draft of the Kyoto Protocol. So that's on the book. That means the establishment can't ignore it, but so far they are. Although I did get a call from ITN News the other day that said, we're reading your book. We really like it. The science editor remembers you, but we don't think we can use it. Maybe, it's tricky times to do anything at the moment, Okay, I have some my own theories which I want to contribute to the science of, which I've kind of sussed out. And I'll if I've got time, I will write a paper on it. Global warming is not homogeneous. It's not global. It's actually, the dark bits are the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. And there are various technical reasons for why the warm water, which is mostly created in the equator, gets spun north and south by currents. And that's the whole of the warmth that keeps the planet warm, is in actually the top 200 meters of the ocean, generally. And it interchanges with the atmosphere. When it goes south, it gets spun around. There's not a lot of land south. In fact, between South America and South Africa and Australia, there's 2,000 miles of open ocean. When it gets spun around there, it's in an area of what's called permanent heat deficit. So it loses all the heat it's gained. Southern oceans have not globally warmed that much. Where the warmth is in the north. Because when the currents come north, they can't get spun around because they're pinched in by the continents. So they create gyres, and the warmth is stored at depth. Now that happens on a cycle. The warmth gets stored and stored and stored and stored. The cycle turns and sucks the heat out. And so eventually, it comes to that point, suddenly the oceans go cold. Now, I'm not going to provide you with lots of proof of that, but it's in the book. The North Pacific went cold in 2007. The North Atlantic is about to go cold. We all know it. By the way, I predicted the jet stream changing from the science that I was studying, the fact that we'd get dumped on and we'd have horrible summers. The first summer we had, 2007, I said something's changed. Talked to the Met Office. No, we don't have anybody studying the jet stream. So that's central to what's happening. 2008, it was repeated. I thought, well, we're into a new cycle. 2009, the Met Office said, it's going to be a glorious summer. Last winter, I said, I think it could be a very severe winter. Oh, no. It was. That's the first in the cycle, from my perspective. And the summer is going my way as well. But no, because our computer models say it shouldn't happen. So they will prefer to believe in the virtual reality of their computer model. The top bit is when we adjust our computer models, the carbon dioxide, if we take the carbon dioxide out of the virtual reality we've created, we don't get a temperature rise. I said, well, of course you don't, because you haven't got a cycle in there. So the cycles put the temperature up, and you're saying the carbon dioxide's put it up. And at the moment, they are behind the scenes going, we may have got it wrong. But only because the cycles are turning. If the cycles hadn't turned, we wouldn't have a leg to stand on. And one of the reasons the cycles are turning is the sun has gone very, very quiet. It's late with its period. And NASA scientists were predicting when it would take off again, and they were wrong, and they were wrong, and they were wrong, and eventually they're going, okay, we don't really understand, right? We don't know what creates sunspots. We don't know why we haven't got any. Now we can come back into Glastonbury territory. I visited a crop circle on July 5th. It was actually the Mayan one, the Mayan glyph. There was a little bit of magic because I went to meet and have breakfast in Avebury with a friend of mine who's a sacred geometrist, and he was being filmed. And said, let's go find a crop circle. So we went to Silbury Hill, went up the hill, stood in the middle of one that had formed that night, and he's going, this is a glyph from the Mayan calendar. We just spent 2 hours talking about the Mayan calendar, and here it is. I said, yeah, that's how they work, crop circles. And when I got back, there's this one, which is called the Sunspot crop circle, which came on July the 1st. There was also a crop circle of the hummingbird, which is the chief totem that I work with in the ghost dance. So I'm going, okay, I'm listening. Now, on this one, you will notice that there's a little blob there. 28 serpents. This is a Kundalini serpent. And within the sun, there are spiral power vortexes that bring the sunspots to the surface. There are 28 serpents. The sun rotates on a 28-day cycle. So you see a sunspot there, it'll come back 28 days later if it maintains its integrity. And there are various 28, 14, 7, and 2 from July the 1st there. And if you work the calendar from that, what are they trying to tell us? 28 months from now? 14, 28-day cycles? I can't tell you. But that little blob looks like something that is about to be ejected from the sun. And whoever or whatever intelligence is doing this is trying to tell us something. That's what I think they're trying to tell us. In 1859, a major sunspot occurred. And if the same thing happened, the same energy in the same way, because the sun was quite low in its cycle then, you would fry the electricity grids of the planet and every computer chip. NASA and the National Academy of Sciences just made a report to Congress saying, we're not ready for this. It would take us 3 or 4 years to rebuild the grid. That's no electricity for 3 or 4 years. Think about it. No water in the taps, no sewage, no fuel in the pumps, no resupply, no resupplying the supermarkets, no communication, no radio, no TV. And I was talking with another very lovely man from the bubble, Palden Jenkins, who many people know. And he said, there's only one community on the planet that's ready for that. That's where he works, in Gaza. They already know what it's like. And he said, they will survive because they have community. 5 minutes. Okay, that energy comes out not homogeneously from the sun, but in something called the solar wind at its equator. I put that in there because the sunspots are not quite in the right place for that. So I would go 28-day cycles, possibly, or 14 28-day cycles, before, if there is a sunspot, it would come. And they travel down magnetic funnels and can be here within 8 minutes. No warning. Plasma pulse, electromagnetic pulse. This slide, Paul LaViolette is talking this evening. Oh, a huge debt to that man and the way that he's opened up my own thinking. And this was one of his graphs. I was looking for a 5,000-year cycle. The little yellow spike is there in his work. And I was looking actually, before I knew about the Carrington event, I was thinking, my guides, the yogis 29 years ago, and every shaman that I'm in contact with says, no more fighting. What are you doing trying to change their minds? It's all over. It's the ghost dance time. Everything is going to come down. She is going to bring it down. They have all kinds of plans to manipulate and bring the population down. And I'm sure you know about that. But no, it's not going to happen. Be ready, because there's a big wave coming. That's what they always say, is a big wave coming. So eventually it came across Paul's work, the galactic superwave. Now he'll talk about that. And that was there. I was looking for something that was in the Mayan cycle, something that would come before 2012 or there. This is probably unfamiliar to you, but this is the sun. This is its electromagnetic skirt. She dances. She spins on this 28 cycle, and that solar wind comes out, and it's pumping energy, invisible energy to us all of the time, and that's modulated by galactic things going on. But outside there, outside of this room, I can't talk about any of this. Even the scientific stuff is suppressed. But I can't put a spiritual dimension in. If I said shamanic peoples believe we can influence the galaxy, we can influence the sun by dancing, they'd laugh at me. You don't take that seriously, Scientific consciousness rules. What is it? It's the consciousness of the empire. Earlier, when you were doing meditation, scientists don't meditate. It's all left brain, measure, objective reality. There is no other force in the scientific equations. And they create the technology, the engineering, and the mentality that has created what's going to happen to this landscape, to this sacred land. They have no Arthur. They have no sacred king. They have no meeting with the Magdalene. They do not meditate. They don't know what Kundalini is. They don't know why the first shamanic peoples embodied the power of the serpent. They've never felt the wave move through them. So they don't understand waves. They don't understand cycles. They don't like irregular periods because they can't handle them. It's a feminine consciousness that's missing. So that is the energy of the empire. Science allied with the merchants, the bankers, and the military. And that's the empire. It's a business empire. There's no love. There's no ethics. What is it doing? It's creating empire of power. It's a power structure. It's a male power structure, and it sucks. It sucks energy. in order for the empire to stay alive, it has to get into your schools. It has to make sure your children don't learn how to meditate, are disconnected to the earth. When they graduate from university, they've got debt that has to be repaid. They're insecure. They can't afford their rent. So you hit their base chakra. Then the biggest business on the planet, do you know what it is? It's pornography. You pull that energy out of them. You distract them. And the mafia are in control of that. Then you disempower them. You're not here to exercise your own personal authority. You're here to listen to me. I am your teacher. So they learn to sit still and to listen and to obey and to worry if they're going to get a job when their education finishes. And as for their hearts, long ago given up. Their voice, they don't have a voice. Their vision center, long ago shut down. And if you try to protect your kids from that, as I did with Steiner education, eventually they get sucked in. Alcohol damages the pineal gland. And that whole thing, one of my sons said, "Don't worry, Dad, I still remember, but I can't not do it because I wouldn't have any friends." So the last thing I want to say, and again, this is something that you understand. There's a lot more I could go on with Mr. Gore, but it's deliberate. The first scientists that set up the Royal Society were magicians. They were alchemists. They had already been practicing consciousness, meditation. They had a god, a head. It's architectural. It's male. It's Sumerian. It's Kabbalistic. And since 17-odd, when Napoleon's people translated the Egyptian mysteries, they have Egyptian rites. They are magicians. They've always been there. And their biggest trick was to pretend in the science, was to get this scientific education and pretend that they do it too. They don't. They have spiritual practices. They have adept practices. It's all one gigantic trick. And Mr. Gore is a perfect practitioner of this. I don't know how far he gets into the inner cabals. This was a shamanic ally we used to look at Mr. Gore. And, okay. So, the magician wants you to be afraid, to focus on carbon. Earthly life forms, complex, you immediately think about your own survival. And there's one thing, certain death, certain carbon taxes, carbon trading, the whole deal. Over here we have the sun. Solar, elemental, simple, eternal, plasmic web, ethereal, psychic, free spirit, original, creative source. Whatever you do, don't tune into the sun. Tune into the carbon equation. Pay your taxes. Let Mr. Gore look after you. That's the empire. Thank you.
Peter Taylor, everyone.